I'll write this story following your detailed narrative framework. Let me craft a compelling revenge narrative based on your specifications. Poor my wife mocked my job in front of her wealthy guests, so I stayed silent and took what she cherished most. She stood in the center of her own dining room, surrounded by crystal glasses and linen napkins, and laughed at the man who had built every wall around her. She told her guests he was nothing. She told them he had always been nothing. And he stood there, plate in hand, and said not a single word. What would you have done if the person who vowed to love you used you as the punchline of their cruelest joke? If this kind of story speaks to you, hit that like button and make sure you subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. Whether you're tuning in from New York, London, Lagos, or anywhere else in this wide world, let us know you're here. Now, let the story begin. Daniel Mercer was not a man who demanded attention when he walked into a room. He was the kind of man who fixed the leaking pipe before anyone noticed it was dripping, the kind who refilled the coffee without being asked, who stayed late without logging the hours, who smiled at strangers in elevators because it cost him nothing and might mean everything to them. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and a quiet face that people often mistook for vacancy. They looked at him and saw plainness. They saw a man in a work shirt standing next to marble countertops and assumed the countertops did not belong to him. They were right. Technically, the countertops belonged to his wife. Everything in the house belonged to his wife. That had always been the arrangement, or rather, that had always been her insistence, dressed up in the language of practicality and love. Her name was Vivienne. Vivienne Mercer, née Caldwell, was the kind of woman who entered a room and rearranged it simply by standing still. She was striking, polished, and possessed of a social intelligence so precise it could have been surgical. She knew exactly who to charm, who to dismiss, and who to pretend to notice only when it served her. She had grown up with money, not obscene money, but enough money that its absence felt like an insult. And she had spent her adult life constructing a world in which she was never reminded of that absence. Daniel had met her 12 years ago at a charity gala he had attended on behalf of a client. He had been there as a contractor, not a guest, overseeing some last-minute electrical work before the evening began. She had found him in a side corridor, crouched over a junction box, and, instead of walking past, she had stopped and asked him what he was doing. He had told her, she had laughed, genuinely at the time, and said she had never met anyone who could explain electrical current and make it sound like poetry. They had married 18 months later. For a while it was good, or at least it looked good from the outside, which to Vivienne was very nearly the same thing. But Daniel had started to notice the cracks long before they became chasms. The first time she had corrected him in public was 2 years into the marriage. A dinner with colleagues of hers from the architectural firm where she worked as a senior partner. He had made a comment about housing costs, something rooted in what he saw every day on job sites across the city, and she had laughed lightly and said, "Daniel means well, but he's more comfortable with pipes than with policy." The table had laughed. He had smiled and said nothing. He told himself it was nerves, that she was performing for her peers, that at home, in the quiet, she was the woman he had married. But home became a performance too, after a while, especially once her mother entered the picture with more frequency. Eloise Caldwell was 70 years old and had the emotional temperature of a mid-January frost. She had never fully accepted Daniel. To Eloise, and her daughter had committed a kind of social self-harm by marrying a tradesman and no amount of Daniel's quiet competence or genuine warmth could compensate for the fact that he arrived at parties with grease occasionally still visible beneath his thumbnail. Eloise visited often. More often once Daniel and Vivian moved into the house in Harlow Heights, a neighborhood of manicured hedges and aggressively similar driveways, which Daniel had spent 14 months renovating almost entirely by himself after Vivian had purchased it for a price that had made even her flinch. He had done the plumbing. He had rewired the entire second floor, and he had laid the hardwood in the hallways and retiled the kitchen and rebuilt the back deck from raw timber because the contractor they had originally hired had quoted them a number Vivian called offensive. When the house was finished, Vivian had hosted a dinner party to show it off. She had introduced Daniel to her guests as the man who keeps the lights on, and everyone had smiled politely, and Daniel had refilled the wine and thought about the load-bearing wall he had reinforced in the east corridor because the original structure was quietly failing, and wondered if anyone in the room understood how close they had been to disaster. Nobody did. That was the nature of quiet competence. It was invisible until it wasn't there. The years accumulated, the corrections became habits, the habits became contempt, and Vivienne stopped asking his opinion on anything that mattered. She started making financial decisions without him, travel plans without him, social arrangements that placed him in rooms where he was ornamental and peripheral. She had begun, in the language of her social circle, to treat him like staff, and Daniel, because he was Daniel, had endured it. He had told himself that marriage was long and that people changed, and that the good years they'd had were real, even if they felt distant now. He had told himself that patience was not weakness. He had a habit of sitting on the back deck in the evenings after work, drinking 1 cup of tea, looking at the wood he had laid with his own hands, and allowing himself to be very quietly sad. It was on one of those evenings, about 3 months before everything changed, that he noticed the envelope. He had been cleaning out a section of the garage. Vivian had asked him to make space for the additional storage units she was planning to order, when he found an old cardboard box he didn't recognize. It had been pushed to the very back of a high shelf, behind paint cans and spare tile adhesive, in a corner where Vivienne would have needed a ladder to reach, and therefore, he suspected, had never looked. The box was dusty. It had his name on it, written in handwriting he didn't immediately recognize. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed newspaper, were documents, and an envelope, sealed, also addressed to him, in the same unfamiliar hand. He had carried the box inside without opening the envelope. He wasn't sure why. Something in him, some instinct he couldn't yet name, told him to wait, to think, to find the right moment and the right silence before he pulled that thread. He put the box in his truck. Vivienne did not notice it was gone. He should explain at this point what his daily life actually looked like, because the distance between what Vivian told people about him and what was true had grown so wide by then that they occupied different realities entirely. Daniel ran a company, not a large company, not a company with glass offices and a marketing department, but a company nonetheless. Mercer Electrical and Infrastructure, which he had built from a one-man operation into a team of 11. They handled commercial and residential electrical work, yes, but also infrastructure assessment for small municipalities, compliance inspections for commercial properties, and emergency structural support coordination for contractors who had found themselves in over their heads. His clients were loyal. His reputation was excellent. He had, in the past fiscal year, turned over just under $900,000 in revenue, of which roughly a third had been his personal take-home after expenses and salaries. He had never told Vivienne the exact numbers. Not out of deception, or not entirely. It had started early in the marriage as a kind of protection. She had made it clear, without ever saying so directly, that money impressed her, and he had not wanted her to value him for the numbers rather than for the person. He had wanted to be known before he was assessed. Over time, the privacy had calcified into habit. He paid the household expenses she asked him to pay. He contributed to the joint account the amount she had specified, and the rest he managed quietly in accounts she had never asked about because she had never imagined there was anything worth asking about. He was, in her mind, a contractor with calloused hands, which made what happened at the dinner party in November all the more devastating. Vivienne had organized the event for weeks. It was for 7 guests, 2 couples from her firm, a property developer named Stuart with his considerably younger girlfriend, and Eloise, who arrived 40 minutes early and spent that time standing in the kitchen offering commentary on the canapés. Daniel had cooked. He was a better cook than Vivienne, and they both knew it, though she introduced the meal as something she had put together. The evening had started well enough. The wine was good. The conversation moved through the usual channels. Property values, a recent gallery opening, the renovation of some building near the harbour that 3 of the guests had opinions about. And then Stuart, with the confidence of a man who considered all silences to be invitations, turned to Daniel and said, "So what is it you do, Daniel?" Daniel had opened his mouth, and Vivienne had answered for him. "Daniel is in trades," she said, with a smile so perfectly calibrated it had no warmth left in it at all. "Electrical work. The unglamorous stuff none of us want to think about." There was a small, polished laughter around the table. Stuart nodded with the expression of someone filing information into a category marked unimportant. Eloise, from her position at the corner of the table, added without looking up from her plate, "Vivienne always had a generous heart." The implication hung in the room like smoke. Daniel set down his fork. He looked at his wife. She was smiling at Stuart now, pivoting the conversation back to something about a development project near the waterfront, her laugh light and practiced and entirely natural. She had not even glanced at him. He picked his fork back up. He finished his meal. He cleared the plates when the course was done. He brought out the dessert and poured the coffee and said the correct pleasant things at the correct pleasant intervals. And when the guests had gone and Eloise had been driven home by the car service Vivienne always arranged for her, he washed the dishes. Vivienne came into the kitchen while he was drying the last pan. "Good evening," she said, but she was looking at her phone. "Was it?" he said. She glanced up briefly. "You were quiet." "I was listening." She made a small sound, not quite agreement, not quite dismissal, and went upstairs. He stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. The house was very still. Through the window he could see the back deck, dark and silent, the wood he had laid plank by plank with his own hands, barely visible in the winter dark. He went to his truck. He got the box. He sat at the kitchen table and he opened the envelope. The handwriting inside was his grandfather's. His grandfather, Thomas Mercer, had died 6 years before Daniel was born. He had never known the man except through a small, framed photograph and the occasional comment from his father, a quiet man himself. Given to brevity, that Thomas had been someone who planned ahead. The letter was short, formal in the way that men of that generation were formal. It directed Daniel to contact a firm of solicitors in the city of his grandfather's birth, a small coastal town called Carrick Bay, with reference to a matter of held assets. Daniel read it 3 times. Then he looked at the documents in the box. There were property records, old ones, heavy with stamps and notarial seals, land records for a parcel outside Carrick Bay transferred from Thomas Mercer to a holding trust with Daniel's full name listed as the sole beneficiary upon reaching the age of 40. He was 41. He had reached that age with no one telling him what it meant. His hands were entirely steady when he set the papers down. His breathing was calm. He noted, keen with some distant part of himself, that he did not feel excitement or shock so much as the quiet, specific sensation of a key turning in a lock that had always been there, waiting. He slept better than he had in years. 3 days later, on a Thursday morning, he told his site manager he would be unavailable for the afternoon, and he drove to the city. The law firm was called Hennessy and Birch, and it occupied a suite of offices on the 4th floor of a building that had been built when buildings still expressed ambition through their facades. A receptionist led him to a conference room where a solicitor named Grace Hennessy, who had the manner of someone who had spent decades being trusted with important things, was already seated. She stood when he entered. She shook his hand with both of hers. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "we've been wondering when you would come." He sat down. What she told him in the next 90 minutes reordered the architecture of everything. His grandfather Thomas had been, by the standards of his time and place, a man of significant means. He had not looked it. That apparently ran in the family, and he had spent his life treating wealth as a private matter, the way some people treated faith. But over the decades he had acquired land, and not just any land. The parcel outside Carrick Bay, a stretch of coastal property that Thomas had purchased in the 1950s for almost nothing, because at the time it was considered too remote and too rough to be worth anything, had sat quietly in its trust for 60 years, during which time the coastline had changed. Development had crept outward from the city. Tin tourism had transformed the coastal towns, and the parcel outside Carrick Bay, which was 47 acres of cliffside and cove, had become, according to the most recent independent valuation, worth in excess of $40 million. There was also the matter of the trust's investment portfolio. Thomas had been, in addition to everything else, quietly brilliant with money. He had placed the initial trust assets, a combination of cash, bonds, and a minority stake in a regional shipping company, under the management of a conservative but capable firm. For 60 years those assets had grown, compounded, reinvested, and expanded. The current total value of the trust, Grace Hennessy told him, reviewing the figures with the careful precision of someone who understood their weight, was approximately $63 million, and that it belonged entirely to Daniel. There was one specific detail that Grace mentioned almost as an aside, though it would later prove to be the most devastating piece of the entire picture. The shipping company in which the trust held a minority stake had, 22 years ago, been quietly absorbed into a larger logistics conglomerate through a series of corporate restructurings. That conglomerate was now one of the largest freight operators on the eastern seaboard. The company was called Caldwell Maritime Logistics. Grace watched his face when she said it. "The Caldwell family," she said carefully, "holds the majority stake. However, the trust's minority position, approximately 11%, has never been diluted, as your grandfather's original agreement included a non-dilution clause that has survived every restructuring." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "My wife's family name is Caldwell," he said. "Yes," said Grace. "We are aware." He leaned back in his chair. The full scale of it opened in front of him slowly, the way a landscape reveals itself from a hilltop, detail by detail, until the whole of it is suddenly and irrevocably clear. Eloise Caldwell, who had looked down at him across every dinner table for 12 years, who had made her contempt for him into an art form, whose company, and whose family's company, had been paying quarterly dividends into a trust that bore his name, a trust she had never known existed, a trust whose minority stake gave him, according to the corporate governance documents Grace slid across the table, had the right to attend and vote at board meetings. He had been a shareholder in her company for his entire adult life, and she had spent that time calling him unglamorous. He drove home slowly. He needed the time. By the time he pulled into the driveway of the house in Harlow Heights, the house he had rebuilt with his hands and that Vivian called hers, he had made a decision. He would not act in anger, he would act in precision. He contacted Grace the following morning and asked her to begin the process of formally activating his trust ownership. There were filings to complete, notification requirements, corporate registration transfers. It would take time. Grace recommended they move carefully and without announcing their intentions until the legal mechanisms were fully in place. He agreed. He also, on her recommendation, consulted a matrimonial solicitor named Paul Adeyemi, whose offices were on the other side of the city and whose specialty was high net worth asset division. He sat across from Paul in a clean, minimal office and answered questions for 2 hours. Paul reviewed his notes at the end and said, "You understand that the trust, having been established before your marriage and held in your sole name, is almost certainly protected from division." "I suspected," Daniel said. "And the business?" "Mercer Electrical?" "Also premarital, structured as a sole proprietorship converted to a limited company 7 years ago. Her name is not on any document." Paul made a note. "And the matrimonial home?" "Purchased in her name. I have no legal ownership." Paul looked at him. "You've been contributing to the household?" "Financially, substantially. And in terms of labor, I rebuilt the property. I have records, receipts, time logs, contractor quotes for equivalent professional work." "That will be relevant," Paul said. They agreed to begin drafting. November became December. The house in Harlow Heights continued its routines. Vivian hosted, traveled, worked late. Eloise came for Sunday lunches and made her comments. Daniel worked, cooked, maintained, and said nothing unusual. He also quietly did the following. He requested copies of all corporate filings related to Caldwell Maritime Logistics and reviewed them with Grace and a financial analyst she brought in. The 11% stake was confirmed, unencumbered, and current. The annual dividend alone amounted to just over $400,000. For 12 years that dividend had been accumulating in the trust. I reinvested per the trust's default instructions because no beneficiary had ever activated their account. 12 years of dividends accumulated and compounded. He did not do the math all at once. He found it was better to absorb these things gradually. He also discovered through public records research that Grace's paralegal conducted that Caldwell Maritime had recently made a significant loan application to finance the expansion of their northern fleet. The application was with a consortium of private lenders and required, per the company's governance documents, shareholder approval for any debt exceeding a certain threshold. An 11% shareholder who had never attended a meeting and whose ownership had been, in practice, forgotten. Grace wrote to the lender consortium on his behalf. The letter was formal, precise, cabined entirely within his rights. It noted that the trust's governance documents required written notification of and consent to any debt obligation above the threshold, and that no such notification had been provided, and that accordingly the trust was placing a formal hold on its consent pending review of the application terms. The letter went out on a Wednesday. On the following Monday, Daniel was at a job site in the early morning when his phone rang. The number was from a legal firm he didn't recognize. He let it ring and called Grace. "The Caldwell family lawyers have been in contact," Grace told him with a composure that suggested she had been expecting this. "They want to arrange a meeting." "Not yet," Daniel said. "No," Grace agreed. "Not yet." What happened next came in a sequence. each event falling into the next with the clean inevitability of a well-engineered system releasing its load. The lender consortium, faced with an unresolved governance dispute, put the Caldwell Maritime loan application into formal review. This triggered a credit hold on the company's short-term financing arrangements because 3 of the consortium members were also the company's primary revolving credit providers. Caldwell Maritime had, as Grace's analyst had suspected, been operating on the assumption that the loan would close within 60 days. Their cash flow projections had been built around it. Without it, they had a problem. The problem became public on a Thursday, when a trade publication reported that the fleet expansion had been delayed due to financing complications. The article was brief and technical and used cautious language, but in the world of maritime logistics, those words carried significant weight. Eloise Caldwell called Vivian that afternoon. Daniel was in the kitchen when Vivian took the call in the living room. He could hear her voice through the wall, first measured, then increasingly tense, then very quiet in the way that indicated she was receiving information that required her to concentrate on not reacting. He did not change the rhythm of what he was doing, which was chopping vegetables. That evening, Vivian came to the kitchen with an expression he had rarely seen on her face. It was something close to unsettled. "Hey, have you heard anything strange about Caldwell Maritime?" she asked. He set down the knife. "Your mother's company?" "There's been some kind of issue with a shareholder, some old trust. My mother can't find any record of who it is." He looked at her with an expression of mild, thoughtful concern. "That sounds complicated. I hope she's okay." Vivian stared at him for a moment, and something moved behind her eyes. Something between suspicion and dismissal. And then she shook her head and took her phone back to the living room. He picked up the knife. 3 days later, Paul Adeyemi filed the divorce petition. Vivian received the documents at her office on a Tuesday morning. Daniel knew this because Grace had arranged the timing, and because, at 10:37 that morning, Vivian called him 4 times in rapid succession, and he allowed the calls to go to voicemail. He listened to the voicemails at lunch, sitting in his truck outside a job site. The first was controlled with an edge of ice. "Daniel, I need you to call me back immediately." The second was less controlled. "This is completely absurd. Call me." The third was Vivian in a register he had heard perhaps 3 times in 12 years. Stripped of its social veneer, raw and slightly unsteady. "Daniel, where are you? We need to talk about this. You cannot just call me." The fourth was silence for several seconds, then, "I know something is going on. Call me." He called Paul instead. The divorce proceedings, Paul had explained, would require full financial disclosure from both parties. This was the mechanism, as this was the key, turning in the second lock. Because when Vivian's financial disclosure was reviewed alongside the matrimonial home's ownership structure, alongside the evidence of Daniel's 12 years of unrecompensed labor, alongside the formal valuation of his contributions to the property, something Paul had meticulously documented with contractor equivalency reports, the picture that emerged was not the one Vivian had spent 12 years constructing. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had systematically undervalued and appropriated her husband's labor, and who was now attempting to retain sole ownership of an asset he had materially created. Paul was very good at his job. Vivian hired a solicitor. Her solicitor was also very good and made arguments with appropriate force. But the arguments kept meeting the same wall: documentation. Daniel had it. Receipts, dated records, photographs, time logs. He had been documenting his work on the house for years, not strategically. He had simply been organized the way tradesmen are organized. But the documentation was comprehensive. The negotiations were conducted entirely by the solicitors. Daniel did not see Vivian privately during this period. She attempted to arrange a meeting twice through mutual friends. Both times he declined politely and referred her to Paul. He was not punishing her. He was simply done having conversations that served no purpose. The other matter, the one involving Caldwell Maritime, moved on a separate track. Grace had formally notified the Caldwell family's legal representatives that their client wished to discuss the trust's corporate position. A meeting was arranged for the second week of January at a neutral location, a conference room at Grace's firm. Eloise Caldwell attended in person. Daniel had not seen her since before the dinner party in November. She arrived in a dark coat with her solicitor beside her and her company's chief financial officer slightly behind, and she walked into the conference room with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in a room. She did not recognize Daniel immediately, seated at the far end of the table in a suit that he had purchased specifically for this occasion. Then she did. The silence that followed was one of the more complete silences he had ever experienced, and he watched the recognition move across her face, the confusion first, then a rapid, almost visible recalculation as the pieces assembled themselves. The trust, the minority stake, the hold on the loan, the man her daughter had married, the tradesman, the unglamorous one, sitting at the head of a conference table in a law firm with a solicitor on one side and a financial analyst on the other. "Daniel," she said, and his name in her mouth sounded like a word she had never needed to learn to pronounce correctly, and was now discovering had weight. "Eloise," he said. He did not stand, he let Grace lead the legal portion of the meeting. It was not his job to explain the mechanisms. It was his job to be present while they were explained, which he understood was itself a kind of statement. The trust held 11% of Caldwell Maritime, and the trust had never been represented at any board meeting, and its governance rights had been functionally dormant. But they had never been extinguished, and now that they were active fully. The loan application required his consent. The terms under which he would provide that consent were outlined in a document Grace slid across the table. The terms were not punitive. He was not a cruel man, but they were comprehensive. They included a formal seat on the board, transparent quarterly reporting directly to the trust, an adjustment to the dividend calculation that accounted for 12 years of unreinvested growth that should have been distributed, and a restructuring of the governance documents to prevent similar situations arising in future. Eloise's solicitor made counter-arguments. There was a period of technical discussion. Daniel said very little during this portion. He had said what he needed to say in the documents. The documents were precise and they were correct, and everyone in the room knew it. Near the end, Eloise looked at him across the table with an expression he read as something between fury and a kind of terrible understanding. "How long?" she said, quietly enough that it was almost not a question. "I found out in November," he said. "The same week as the dinner party, as it happens." She closed her eyes for a moment. "You spent years treating me like I was beneath your daughter," he said. "And in all that time, your company was paying dividends into a trust that had my name on it. I was a shareholder in your company, Eloise. Yet I attended your Christmas lunches and helped clear your plates, and you called it generosity." She did not respond. "I'm not interested in destroying anything," he continued. "The company is solid. The board seat is a reasonable request. The dividend correction is a matter of what's owed. None of this is personal." He paused. "The divorce is personal," he added. "But that's a different matter." The meeting ended with a signed agreement in principle, full documentation to follow. Grace shook his hand in the corridor afterward and said, with a professional restraint that he had come to appreciate enormously, "That was very well handled." He thanked her and went to get his truck. The divorce was finalized in March. The settlement was not what Vivian had anticipated. Or Paul had argued the case for Daniel's contributions to the matrimonial home with the documentation he had accumulated, and the court's assessment of those contributions resulted in an equitable division that Vivian's solicitor privately told her was the best outcome available given the circumstances. Vivian kept the house. She also kept its mortgage, which was more substantial than she had previously chosen to acknowledge, and which she was now solely responsible for on a single income. Daniel kept everything in his own name, which was everything that mattered. He had moved into a furnished rental in October when Paul had told him it was strategically advisable to establish separate residence. On the rental was a second-floor flat above a hardware store in a part of the city that had not been gentrified yet and was therefore quiet and affordable and full of the kind of people who nodded at you in the corridor and didn't ask questions. He liked it very much. He took 2 weeks off in April. He drove to Carrick Bay with no particular plan. He had arranged through Grace to visit the property, his property, the 47 acres of cliff and cove, and he spent 3 days walking it morning to evening, learning its shapes. It was extraordinary. The land ran from a rough-grassed headland down to a natural cove with a shingle beach, bordered on 2 sides by old stone walls and on the third by the sea. There was a derelict building at the northern end, a former farmhouse, judging by its structure, that had been empty for decades. And he stood inside what had once been the farmhouse's main room, looking at the collapsed sections of roof and the stone walls still absolutely solid after God knew how many winters, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he was somewhere he was supposed to be. He called Grace from the headland that afternoon, with the wind pulling at his collar and the sea doing what the sea does. "I'd like to restore it," he said. "The farmhouse?" "The whole property. There's a building here I want to turn into something. A training centre, maybe. Practical skills, trades." He paused. "There are a lot of young people in this region who don't have access to quality technical training. I'd like to do something about that." Grace was quiet for a moment. "I think that's a wonderful use of the asset," she said. He stood on the headland and looked at the water and thought about his grandfather, who had looked at this same view and understood that some things grow best when they are left alone, quiet and patient until the time is right. He thought about Vivienne, who was at this moment in Harlow Heights, managing a mortgage she had never adequately considered. He thought about Eloise, who was attending her first board meeting since the restructuring, at which Daniel's seat would be visibly present even in his absence, held by a proxy he had appointed. He thought about the dinner party in November and the sound of polished laughter, and the specific sensation of setting down a fork and deciding, without fanfare or announcement, that something was over. He had not said anything that night. He had carried the plates. He had poured the coffee. He had washed the dishes. He had done all of it with complete attention because it was the last time he would do any of it, and he had wanted to be present for the ending. There are people in this world who mistake silence for emptiness. They look at a still surface and assume there is nothing beneath it. They hear no complaint and conclude there is nothing to complain about. They see endurance and call it weakness because they themselves could not endure. Daniel Mercer had been enduring for 12 years. He had been building, not just houses and decks and rewired corridors, but something slower and harder to see. He had been building the ground beneath his own feet, plank by plank in the quiet, without asking anyone to notice. When Vivienne had laughed at him across her dinner table, she had made the specific error of assuming that she knew the full dimensions of what she was laughing at. She had not. True power, as it turned out, was not something you displayed at dinner parties. It did not arrive in a room announcing itself. It lived in envelopes in dusty boxes, in holding trusts with 60 years of compound interest, in meticulous records of labour performed without complaint. It lived in the decision to act only when the time was right and not a moment before. And when it finally moved, it was not angry, it was just accurate. Vivian sold the house in Harlow Heights 14 months later when the mortgage became untenable without a second income. She moved to a smaller property on the eastern side of the city. She had, from what Daniel heard through Paul's procedural updates, gone through a period of attempting to contest the divorce settlement, and then a period of attempting to renegotiate the terms of the matrimonial home division, and then a period of simply adjusting. He wished her no particular harm. He also felt no particular sadness. Eloise Caldwell attended 3 board meetings in the first year of the restructured governance arrangement. On each occasion, Daniel's proxy voted on every resolution in accordance with the trust's stated interests. On one occasion, the proxy vote was decisive. Eloise had opposed the resolution. The resolution passed. She did not speak publicly about the situation. Daniel, for his part, had never needed her to. By autumn, the farmhouse restoration at Carrick Bay was underway. He had hired a small local firm to handle the structural work, and overseen by a young site manager named Connell, who had grown up in the area and treated every stone in the building with a kind of reverence that Daniel immediately recognized and respected. He spent long weekends on the property during the build, staying in a rented cottage in the village below the headland. In the evenings he walked the cove and occasionally ate at the single pub in the village, where he was eventually recognized as the man doing something with the old Mercer land. He had not known until the publican mentioned it that the locals had always called it the Mercer land. Even all those years it had kept his family's name. He met someone in November, almost exactly a year after the dinner party. Her name was Aoif. She was a marine biologist based in Carrick Bay, part of a research team studying the seabird colonies that nested on his headland. She had written to Grace's office formally requesting continued research access, not knowing who the new owner was. He had written back to say access was welcomed and asked if she would like to discuss the long-term stewardship of the site. They had met for coffee, which became lunch, which became a walk to the headland, during which she had explained the nesting patterns of 3 species of seabird in terms he found genuinely fascinating, and he had explained the structural history of the farmhouse building in terms she apparently found genuinely fascinating, and it was very late before either of them thought to check the time. She was kind, she was honest, she had no interest in his trust, or his board seat, or his address. Because she did not know about any of those things, and when she did find out much later, she laughed and said that in her experience, the most interesting people were always the quiet ones. He thought that was a very reasonable observation. The training centre opened the following spring in the restored farmhouse and a pair of new outbuildings that Connell's team had built with a care that made them look like they had always been there. They ran introductory programs in electrical work, plumbing, carpentry, and structural assessment. The first cohort was 12 students. The waiting list for the second cohort had 43 names on it. Daniel taught 3 of the modules himself. He was, it turned out, very good at explaining things. He had always been able to do it. Vivian had even said so once, a long time ago, while in a side corridor at a charity gala, when she had stopped to listen to him describe electrical current and told him he made it sound like poetry. He thought of that sometimes, not with bitterness, just with the clarity that comes from standing on ground. You have built yourself in a place that holds your family name, watching the sea do what the sea has always done. He thought, I was always this. You just never looked. If Daniel's story left you with something, a thought, a feeling, a memory of a time when someone underestimated you, drop it in the comments. What would you have done in his position? I'd genuinely like to know. And if this story meant something to you, please give it a like. It helps more people find these stories, and these stories deserve to be found. I'll see you in the next one.